Hello, and welcome to Demystifying Permissions: How, When, and Why to Obtain Permission. The goal of this presentation is to provide you with the legal requirements and proper procedures for borrowing images and text from other copyrighted sources for use in your journal, manuscript, or book chapter. My name is Hop Wexler, and I am Elsevier's Permissions Help Desk Manager. It's important to understand what we mean by permissions in order to understand why permissions are necessary and what procedures you should follow in obtaining them. In this presentation, we will focus on answering these common questions. What is permission, and why do I need to obtain it? How does an acknowledgement differ from a permission? What content does and what content does not typically require permission? What is fair use, and how and when does it apply? How are permissions obtained, and what proof do I need that I obtained them? Finally, what if I can't obtain permission? What should I do? Throughout this slide deck, we will help clear up common misconceptions authors who are unfamiliar with this process may have, and ensure that you have up-to-date and accurate information as you prepare your manuscript. A brief quiz will follow at the conclusion of this presentation to help identify any areas where you may need to be especially careful. Black's Legal Dictionary defines permission as a license to do a thing. A written license or other authorization granted by the rights holder is required in order to reuse any copyrighted material within your manuscript. Permission must be in writing. Verbal approval will not be accepted. Permission must be granted by the rights holder, which in many cases is the publisher of the copyrighted material and not the author of the material. Please also note that a work may be copyrighted even if it does not use the copyright symbol, the C with the circle around it, or has not been formally registered. You can generally assume that a work is copyrighted and will require permission unless it explicitly tells you that it does not. Using copyrighted material without permission of the rights holder is both a legal and an ethical concern. This is especially important when your manuscript is published both in print and online, which increases the number of readers who will notice the material and the chances you could be accused of willful infringement, which means you knew you didn't have authorization to use the material but decided to do it anyway, and could become even more difficult and expensive to resolve. If you discover that a permission is missing once your manuscript is already published, please bring this matter to the attention of your publisher, as you will likely need to obtain permission retroactively so that the permanent record can be corrected. It's always better to do so rather than simply ignoring the problem. Any work that's not original to your manuscript must be acknowledged. In other words, you always must cite the original source of any borrowed material. This is an ethical issue, as failure to acknowledge your sources can constitute plagiarism, or, if it's your own prior work, self-plagiarism. Permission, on the other hand, is the actual written authorization to borrow the material, which will often include the rights holder's requirement for how the material should be acknowledged. Although it's always necessary to acknowledge borrowed material, acknowledgement alone is not sufficient for copyrighted material. You must also obtain permission to use the material. Any type of content can require permission. Tables, graphs, text excerpts, videos, screenshots, even a simple bar chart. If the work is original, which has a very broad meaning under copyright law, it can be copyrighted, and permission would be required to reuse it. Some material you may wish to borrow can be in the public domain, which means it is not copyrighted or that copyright has expired. For example, U.S. government works are not copyrighted. U.S. works published prior to 1923 are also now in the public domain because copyright has expired. However, material found on the internet, even if the copyright holder may be difficult to locate, is probably not in the public domain unless it is clearly identified as being in the public domain. For example, a U.S. government website where this information is explicitly mentioned. Otherwise, material that may be freely accessible on the internet will still require permission for you to republish as part of your manuscript. Also, even if you're using public domain material, you still must acknowledge the original source of the material, as acknowledgement is always required even where permission is. Fair use legally refers to a defense to a copyright infringement claim and is used to apply to photocopying for educational or research purposes, but not to republication. It should not be used to justify choosing not to obtain permission from the rights holder to reuse copyrighted material in your manuscript. Ultimately, only courts can determine whether or not your use of material is fair use. When in doubt, it's better to obtain written permission. Please note that you generally would not require permission merely to reference a source, or in many cases, to quote a limited amount of text in your manuscript, for example, up to 50 words from a book. Different publishers may have different requirements, however, so it's best to check first rather than to assume. In order to obtain permission, you will first need to determine who owns the rights to the material you want to borrow. In many cases, this is the publisher, but it may also be the author or a company or other party. Your publisher contact should be able to provide a form that you can complete and send to the rights holder that will outline the specific rights you'll need to request. For example, if your contribution will be published in both a print book and an e-book, you will need to obtain both print and electronic rights to reuse the material. Many publishers will ask that rather than the form your publisher contact gave you, you instead complete a form on their website with similar information, or apply via an automated service such as RightsLink. This is usually acceptable provided that the rights you obtain are the same rights, for example, print and electronic rights, that you need in order to publish your contribution. You can check with your publisher contact if it's ever unclear whether or not you're applying for and obtaining the correct rights from any other publisher who asks that you complete their form prior to granting permission. Written proof that permission has been obtained is the best evidence you have followed all necessary procedures to use copyrighted material in your manuscript. In many cases, this will be a formal permissions license that includes terms and conditions, such as the credit line you should use to acknowledge the material. An informal email can also be acceptable if it contains all necessary information. Please also note that if your publisher is an STM signatory publisher, which means they are a member of an organization of scientific, technical, and medical publisher who has agreed to follow certain permissions procedures, a limited amount of material can be used free of charge and from certain STM publishers only without written permission. Please visit the STM website or check with your publisher contact for more information about the STM guidelines. Sometimes you may not be able to locate the owner of material you want to borrow. For example, the publisher may no longer exist, or the publisher may have reverted the rights to the author who's now deceased, and you can't locate their next of kin. If you do not wish to remove or replace the material but still want to use it anyway, you should talk to your publisher contact to determine whether they're willing to proceed. If you decide to use the material anyway, you still need to acknowledge the original source and keep written records of any attempts you made to obtain the permission. And now it's time for a quiz. This brief quiz will allow you to test your knowledge of several common myths about permissions and copyright. Scenario 1. It's on the internet. Alana, author, wanted to provide some case studies to illustrate the point she was trying to make in her book. She searched the internet and found a lengthy news item on a website that had all the right elements she was looking for. She took the item and republished it in its entirety without paraphrasing and without acknowledging the source. Pick the correct answer from the following. A. This is perfectly acceptable. Material found on the internet is in the public domain. B. This is not acceptable. Alana needed to cite the source, but did not require written permission. Or C. This is not acceptable. Alana needed to obtain permission from the rights holder to use the story and also needed to acknowledge the source. The correct answer is C. This is not acceptable. In order for Alana to republish the story in its entirety, permission is required from the rights holder. This is true even though the story is freely available on the internet. She also needs to acknowledge the source. Scenario 2, I acknowledge the source. Riza Writer found this image in another scholarly journal and decided to use it to illustrate his manuscript. He made sure that he noted exactly where it came from so that he would not run into any issues with using it. Pick the correct answer from the following. A, this is perfectly acceptable. Authors need only cite the source of any images used. B, this is not acceptable. Written permission from the scholarly journal in which the image appeared was necessary. Or C, this is not acceptable. Written permission from Sarah Scott, the photographer who retained copyright, was necessary. The correct answer here is C. This is not acceptable. Riza needed written permission from the copyright holder, who here is Sarah Scott, the photographer. Scenario 3, it's good publicity. Emma and Etienne, editor, want to include a photograph they took of a recognizable brand name medical device in their book. They don't request permission because they took the photo themselves, and besides, the device manufacturer is struggling financially. They would appreciate the publicity. True or false? Permission is not required here. True. It's good publicity, and the editors took the photo themselves. Or false? While the manufacturer might well appreciate the publicity, they own the product, which is recognizable in the photo, regardless of who took the photo. The answer is false. The editors need written permission from the manufacturer to include this photo in their book, since their product is recognizable. Scenario 4, she told me I could use it. In the process of preparing her manuscript, Claudia Contributor borrowed figures and text excerpts from a journal article written by her colleague Cecilia. Claudia told Cecilia she was doing this, and Cecilia told her this was fine. Pick the correct answer from A, nothing is wrong, this is fine. B, written permission was necessary from Cecilia. Or C, written permission was necessary from someone who may or may not have been Cecilia. The correct answer is C. Written permission was required, possibly from Cecilia, but more likely from the publisher of the journal, as the publisher would now own the copyright. And scenario 5, I tried 3 times, but they didn't respond. Srikanth Sender wanted to use a copyrighted image in his chapter. He attempted to contact the copyright holder 3 times by email to request permission, but they didn't respond. He decided to use the image anyway. Is the correct answer A, it's not a problem? Under most copyright law, if you attempt to request permission 3 times and no one responds, it's considered fair use. Or B, it's a potential problem, but only because 3 times isn't enough to provide legal immunity. He needs at least 10 times. C, it's a potential problem, but only because Srikanth might be using the wrong email address. If he confirms this was the correct address, it's not a problem. Or D, it's a problem because he does not have written permission from the copyright holder. The answer here is D. While keeping a paper trail can help demonstrate your good faith efforts to obtain permission, ultimately there is no legal substitute for written permission from the rights holder. Many resources are available online that can assist you further in determining whether material is copyrighted, if so, by whom, and how to obtain their permission. While this list is not exhaustive, it does provide a starting point to help ensure that you're aware of the procedures you will need to follow when using borrowed material in your content. Elsevier provides its authors with several permissions resources, including a frequently asked questions page for authors, as well as a general publishing ethics. Elsevier also has a dedicated permissions help desk available to assist authors with the permission-seeking process. This presentation has identified some of the most common permissions myths about using copyrighted material. By obtaining the appropriate and necessary permissions, you not only establish yourself as an ethical and professional author, but you protect yourself against potential lawsuits. These resources provide additional insights and information to help you in this vital part of publishing.